In this lecture, we're going to talk a little more about the assessments. Normally, when we start a risk assessment, we go in and look at the current countermeasures, whatever is in place now, because it's very, very rare for us to start with a blank slate. We go in and look at the countermeasures. How good are the current countermeasures? Are they good enough for what we need, or do we need to improve them? Maybe they're not. Well, then we need to implement entirely new countermeasures. Now, let's look at the actual risk analysis, and we touched on these briefly before. The qualitative risk analysis, we sit down, we guess, how likely is this to happen, and how bad is it if it does? How exposed are we? It's vague, it's guessing, it's pretty quick to do, and that was what we used to identify the areas we want to take to quantitative risk analysis. And to remember the difference here quickly, qualitative is quality, something is good, that is pretty good, it's a nice quality, it's not a specific number, it is an opinion, which then takes us to quantitative risk analysis, that is fact-based. And if you look at the image over here on the right, that is qualitative risk analysis with a risk analysis matrix. Again here, it is the likelihood and the consequences. How likely is something to happen? How bad is it if it does? So let's pick an asset. We can say it's a laptop. How likely is it that an employee gets a laptop stolen or they forget it somewhere? I would say that's probably likely. Then we look at the consequences. How bad is this if it happens? And again here, this depends on the data on the laptop. Laptops themselves are not super expensive. It can also factor in if the laptop is encrypted. Does it contain sensitive data? Let's, for this example, say there's no confidential data, but there is some information that we don't want to get out there. So it is sensitive, but it is not confidential. So let's say it's a minor issue. If we look at the matrix over here on the right, likely and minor is still high risk. Since it is high risk, this is probably something we should look at in quantitative risk analysis. And let's jump ahead of ourselves and we say we implement an effective countermeasure, and whatever we have done has changed it from a high risk to a medium or low risk. If it is at that point, that might be where we say, okay, this is enough. The residual risk, the risk that is still left over, we're okay to accept that. And we do this qualitative risk analysis for all our assets, both tangible and intangible. Once we have done that, then we'll go into quantitative risk analysis. And here we focus on everything that was high enough in the qualitative risk analysis, and this is where we put the numbers to the feelings. For something like this, we would most likely use a risk register. And just like many other things that we do in IT and cybersecurity, it's going to look like a giant Excel spreadsheet. Whereas in the qualitative risk analysis, we looked at likelihood and impact. With the risk register, we look at many more factors. And we then use that to prioritize which other risks that we're going to do something about. We can do this for the entire enterprise, anything that can be seen as a risk, and then we categorize the risks. We give them a name, we give them a number, and again, we use the probability and impact, and then do we have any suggestions for mitigation? And mitigation really just means how can we lower that risk? What are we going to do to fix it? And then we look at contingencies. What do we do when this risk actualizes? And then based on all those factors, we give it a risk score. This is the risk score now. After the mitigations we have implemented, the risk score is going to be lower. If that score is low enough, if the residual risk is acceptable, well then we stop doing the mitigations. In the risk register, we will also look at who needs to fix this and when do they need to have it fixed by. And then from all that data, we pick the highest risks. But remember here, if we do one mitigation, that might fix multiple problems or at least lower the risk score to an acceptable level. But that one mitigation can also open up new risks. So the cycle repeat. It is iterative. And here are some more abbreviations and some more math. It's not horribly complicated. I don't think you need to do the math on the exam, but I would clearly understand what all of these mean, where we use them, and why we use them. For any given asset, we look at the asset value. Remember, tangible and intangible. Then we look at how much of the asset is compromised. How much will one incident cost? How often do these incidences occur? And how much is that going to cost us every year? And they are to some extent logical. AV is the asset value. How much is that one asset worth? Then we have the exposure factor, or EF. How much of the asset is lost in an incident? And in a minute, we'll do some quick examples so they will make more sense. Then we have SLE, single loss expectancy. That is, how much is it going to cost us if this happens once? And then finally, we have ARO, annual rate of occurrence. How often does this happen every year? Then we look at the annualized loss expectancy. What does this cost us every year if we don't do anything, if we don't have any mitigation? And then finally, TCO, total cost of ownership. What does the mitigation cost us, both upfront and ongoing cost, if we're going to incur anything that is reoccurring? Let's look at the example of a laptop. If we say that the actual asset value for each laptop is $11,000, the laptop itself costs $1,000 to buy and configure right, and then the PII, the data on the laptop, is worth $10,000 per loss. Well, that's then the asset value. That asset is worth $11,000. Now, when a laptop gets stolen or someone forgets it somewhere, it's completely gone. It's 100% loss. Had this been a data center and we lost 25% of the data center, then the exposure factor would be 25%. So for us, the single loss expectancy is the asset value times the exposure factor. So 11,000 times 100%, 11,000. Then the annual rate of occurrence, we lose 25 laptops every year. It occurs 25 times. So our annualized loss expectancy, the ALE, is $275,000 every year. So after doing our risk analysis, we decide that we want full disk encryption on the laptop and we want the ability to wipe them remotely. And to wipe them remotely really just means that we can delete all the data on the laptop without having it in our possession. Obviously, it needs to be connected to some sort of network. And probably if we do the disk encryption right, we do it strong enough, the remote wipe might not matter. Regardless, we're doing both. That's going to cost us $100,000 a year. We had an annualized loss of $275,000 if we do nothing, so our solution will be cheaper. We are still going to lose the laptops, right? It's only the data exposure that we don't suffer. So by spending $100,000, we save $175,000. And that's really risk analysis at its core. We want a positive ROI, return on investment. We don't spend more money to fix a problem that it's going to save us. You don't spend $100 to save $25,000. Now, for the laptop, if the countermeasure would have cost us $1 million instead of $100,000, well then it just wouldn't be worth it. In that case, we would probably just accept the risk. We could also do risk transference. Maybe we can insure a way out of this problem. We might be able to insure each laptop for $1,000, and if we lose it, they might pay us $5,000. Since this is such an oversimplified example, probably not, but just be aware we can do risk transference. Or we could just say, well, we don't really need laptops. We're going to avoid the risk by not issuing laptops, well then they're not going to get stolen. In most corporate environments that may not work, but in our scenario it might. And then finally, the last one, right? The one that we never ever do. Risk rejection. We just kind of ignore the problem. That is never ever acceptable. It's completely fine. We have done the analysis. We know it's not worth implementing any mitigation. We just accept the risk. Completely fine. You did your due diligence. You did your due care. But you can't just skip that and say, we just don't care. Now you are liable and you are negligent. Another term you should be aware of here is secondary risk. When we fix one risk, another risk might open up. That's just like when we talked about patching. That patch might fix 99 problems, but it may open up entirely different vulnerabilities. If this secondary risk is big enough, the likelihood and the impact, well then we might need to do other risk mitigation here. And with that, we are done with this lecture. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next one.